Hi guys, I'm back with the tag video, and this is going to be the mid-year book tag, even though it's clearly not the middle of the year. But you know, I did my favorite reads of 2017 sometime at the end of January, so I guess this kind of thing is on brand for me. But anyway, thank you so much to Bruno for tagging me, and let's get on with the questions. Question 1. Best book you read so far in 2018? I've actually had a pretty good reading year so far, so it was hard to pick a favorite. But when I was looking at the list of my 5-star reads of the year, I finally settled on The Shape of the Ruins by Juan Gabriel Vasquez. And this was translated from the Spanish by Anne McLean. And it's a Colombian novel that takes the reader on a journey through some of the politically motivated violence of 20th century Colombia. In particular, it looks at 2 defining assassinations of liberal politicians, one in 1914 and another in 1948, which led to a lot of political turmoil in the country. And this book is actually very hard to categorize in terms of genre. It's part historical fiction, part memoir, political thriller, courtroom drama, and a bit of conspiracy theory. And at its core, it's a piece of autofiction in which the author presents himself as the protagonist, and through some acquaintances he gets pulled into the world of people who have essentially organized their whole lives around this conspiracy theory that connects these 2 assassinations. And the author sets out to uncover the truth, and in the process he ruminates on the problems of chronicling history and the inheritance of violence that is passed down for generations. And this is a pretty long book, but I was so engrossed in the story that I read it in just a couple of days. So if this sounds like the type of book you would enjoy, I highly recommend it. Question 2. Best sequel you read so far in 2018? For this I'm going to cheat a little and choose Mouse Volume 2 by Art Spiegelman, because this is the only sequel that I've read this year, even though this is the bind-up of both volumes. And I think everyone pretty much knows what this is about. It's a graphic memoir in which the author chronicles the experiences of his father during the Holocaust in Poland. And it's just a very nuanced and deeply moving exploration of survival and trauma, and an absolute must-read. Question 3. New release you haven't read yet but want to. For this I actually have 3 books to show you, and the first one is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh. And this follows a young privileged woman who is dissatisfied with her life, so she decides to go into narcotic hibernation and basically sleep for a year. So this sounds like a very interesting premise, even though the book has been getting very mixed reviews. But to be honest, so did her previous novels. And she seems to be one of those authors that is very polarizing. But since I've read Eileen and Maglue and enjoyed both of them, I'm really looking forward to reading her newest novel. My second pick is Tea Singer by Dag Solstad, and this was translated from the Norwegian by Tina Nunnally. And this is about a 34-year-old librarian who moves to a small town to start a new life, and he quickly settles down, gets married, has a daughter, but after a couple of years the marriage starts to crumble and they're on the verge of divorce when something unexpected happens that changes the main character's life. And to be honest, the premise doesn't sound that exciting to me, but I've heard that the author has a rather unconventional and bleakly comic writing style. So I have high hopes that he will do something interesting with what appears to be a rather predictable story. And finally, I have In the Distance with You by Carla Gelfenbein, and this was translated from the Spanish by John Cullen. And this is a Chilean novel that's described as a literary thriller that follows three characters whose lives are intertwined with that of a 80-year-old reclusive author whose character is inspired by the famous Brazilian novelist Clarice Lispector. So I was immediately intrigued by this book, and I've seen it on a couple of the recommendations lists for women in translation, so I'm really hoping it's good. Question 4. Most anticipated release for the second half of the year. For this I have two, and the first one is EEG by Dasha Drindic, and this was translated from The Creation, and it's her last novel because sadly the author passed away this year. And it's also the follow-up to her previous novel Belladonna, which follows aging professor who is looking back at his past, and in doing so he discusses in a very critical and unflinching manner some of the most horrific events of 20th century Croatian and European history. And it was a very dense and challenging read, but ultimately very rewarding. So I look forward to reading the sequel. And my second choice is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. And this is coming out very soon. It's the latest book of hers that has been translated into English. Olga Tokarczuk is the winner of this year's Man Booker International Prize for her novel Flights. And this sounds very different. All I know, it's supposed to be a subversive detective story, and I'm very eager to read something else by her. Question 5. Biggest disappointment. I think my biggest disappointment of the year so far was The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins, which I picked up because I was in the mood for a fun urban fantasy story, and I've seen so many rave reviews of this book, but unfortunately for me it just didn't live up to the hype. I mean, there were some very unique and interesting aspects to the book, but my main issue was that I like fantasy stories that have some kind of limitations, and this book just has so many Deus Ex Machina moments that it started to feel ridiculous, and I just quickly lost interest. Question 6. Biggest surprise. For this I chose the short story collection The Last Day by Lithuanian-Ukrainian author Jaroslavas Melnikas, and this was translated by Maria Marcinkute. And short story collections usually end up being a mixed bag, but I was pleasantly surprised how much I enjoyed all 8 stories in this collection. Most of these stories follow protagonists who are dealing with some kind of existential or philosophical dilemma. For example, the title story explores the relationship dynamics between people in a world where everyone can find out the exact date of their death. And other stories deal with fate and people searching for some kind of higher purpose in life. Also trying to escape from the realities of their everyday life, usually in all the wrong places. So I really enjoyed this one, and I think this collection definitely deserves more attention. Question 7. Favorite new author, debut or new to you? For this I'm going to go with the Argentinian author Roque Larraqui for his very interesting and unsettling novel Come Madre. This very slim novel actually contains 2 storylines. One is set in 1907 in a sanatorium on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, where a group of doctors are conducting these gruesome experiments to investigate the threshold between life and death. And the second part of the novel is set 100 years later and follows an avant-garde artist who is pushing the boundaries of art. And these stories are somewhat interconnected, as they both try to explore the idea of immortality. And if you're in the mood for something very weird and darkly comic, then I highly recommend giving this a go. Question 8. Newest fictional crush. Well, I don't really have an answer for this, so I'm just going to skip it. Question 9. Newest favorite character. For this I chose a character called Laura Bow from the science fiction novel I Still Dream by James Smythe, which explores the potential future development of artificial intelligence and the border between man and machine. So as a teenager, Laura Bow invented this primitive AI system that she called Organon after a Kate Bush song. And when her creation gets into the hands of some people that see the potential in it, she gets propelled into the world of Silicon Valley. And the rest of the book basically follows her life story, jumping from decade to decade as the world becomes increasingly reliant on AI technology. It's a very interesting read, but what I liked most about Laura Bow's character is that she's such an intelligent, strong, yet in many ways flawed character that is trying to navigate this professional world that is dominated by men, and that's something that I could totally relate to. Question 10. Book that made you cry, or saddest book you've read. I don't usually cry in books, so I chose a book that made me sad, and that's The Seventh Cross by Anna Segers. And this is a German book that was originally published in 1942, and it provides a glimpse into the lives of ordinary people that were living under the Nazi regime. And it's set in a small town that is close to one of the concentration camps. And the story begins with the escape of 7 prisoners, 6 of which are quickly recaptured, but one manages to evade his pursuers and is on the run. And that creates a lot of tension in the local community. And this is one of those rare books that provides an almost eyewitness account of a particular moment in history and shows the almost banal rise of evil. So I think it's a very moving and timely book. Question 11. Book that made you happy. I'm going to change this question a bit to book that made me laugh, because I haven't read any books this year that made me happy, but there were a couple that made me laugh. And one of them was Bury Me Behind the Baseboard by Pavel Sanayev. And Pavel Sanayev is a Russian writer, film director, actor, and translator. And this is his autobiographical novel about his childhood, growing up during the Soviet era, and especially the years that he spent living with his grandparents. And this is kind of a mix between farce and tragedy, because the grandparents are definitely products of their time and have a very weird way of showing their affection, which provides for many funny moments. But the book at its core is about tyrannical love, and it's hard to describe, but it's very Russian. Question 12. Favorite book to film adaptation you saw this year? I've lately been in the mood to revisit some of my favorites, so I recently rewatched Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo after finally reading the novel that it was based on by Pierre Boileau and Thomas Narcejac. And it's a psychological crime novel that follows a retired San Francisco detective who is investigating a curious case in which the wife of his friend claims that she has been possessed by the spirit of her great-grandmother. And the film is a pretty faithful adaptation exploring the themes of madness and obsession, but I think Hitchcock definitely enhanced the story with the visual nuances that he put into the film, like the symbolic use of color. And it's still one of my favorites. Question 13. Favorite review you've written this year? Well, as I said in my previous video, I've been much more active in the blogging community this year. So that also kind of explains my absence here on Booktube. And one of my favorite reviews to write was for Shadowbound by Steve Erickson. And this book explores an alternate version of America in the near future, in which the Twin Towers mysteriously reappear in the Badlands of South Dakota and seem to transmit music. The towers are completely empty except for one resident who is the grown-up version of the stillborn twin brother of Elvis Presley. Are you still with me? And he seems to be going mad from a voice in his head that he knows isn't his, and from memories of an alternative timeline where he survived in the place of his more famous brother. So Erickson plays with the concept of twins and parallel timelines and explores the theme of identity, both individual and cultural. And similarly to Zeroville, it contains a lot of pop culture references, but instead of film references, this book deals with the history of American popular music and discusses specific songs. There's actually a playlist that includes all the songs that are mentioned in this book, which I highly recommend if you decide to pick it up. And it's one of the most original and exciting books that I've read this year and will probably end up on my list of favorite reads of this year. Question 14. Most beautiful book you've bought in 2018. For this I chose The Largesse of the Sea Maiden by Dennis Johnson. And this is his last short story collection that was published posthumously. And I really like this colorful edition of it. I think it's very interesting and I like how it stands out on my shelf. And I look forward to reading it. I've previously read Train Dreams and Jesus' Son, and I enjoyed both of them. And I've also heard very good things about this one. Question 15. What books do you need to read by the end of the year? There aren't any books that I need to read by the end of the year, but there are a few that I would really like to get to, and one of them is The Woman in the Dunes by Kobo Abe, and this was translated from the Japanese by E. Dale Saunders. And this is the September pick for the Memento Mori Book to Film Club, which I've been kind of following along, and this is one of the books that I was intrigued by the most. It's set in a small village that is half buried in huge sand dunes, and this man is tricked into slavery and required to perform this Sisyphean task of shoveling sand. And yeah, that sounds like a very interesting premise, and I look forward to reading the book and then watching the film. And another book that I'm hoping to get to soon is the first installment in the My Struggle series by Karl Ove Knausgaard. I've been hesitant to pick it up because even though he's such a big name in the world of translated fiction, he's basically the male equivalent of Elena Ferrante in terms of hype and commercial success. I've seen such mixed reviews of this series. Some people think it's brilliant and others feel that it's just an overly long exercise in extreme navel-gazing. But I think I'm finally ready to give it a go and decide for myself. So let's see how it goes. So those were all the questions. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sorry if it turns out to be very long. Let me know if you read any of these books and what you thought of them. And until next time, bye!